Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Flux, and welcome back to General Psychology. Last time, we explored how our attitudes shape our behaviors, and what happens when these attitudes clash with our actions. We explored the ABC model of attitudes, dove into cognitive dissonance, and uncovered how our minds work overtime to keep everything in balance. Today, we're shifting focus to something just as important: how we explain behavior. Not just our own, but other people's too. Why do we give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, but assume the worst in strangers? Why do we sometimes blame the person instead of the situation? This is where attribution theory comes in, and trust me, it's something you'll recognize in your everyday life. But before we dive in, let's do a quick recap from our last lecture to make sure we're all on the same page. Which of the following is an example of an implicit attitude? A, believing that recycling is important and talking about it openly. B, feeling nervous about a certain group of people, even though you consciously believe in equality. C, choosing to exercise because you know it's good for your health. Or D, preferring dogs over cats and telling everyone about it. The answer here is B. This situation refers to an implicit attitude, an aversion to certain groups, that conflicts with an explicit belief, equality. Let's do another one. Which of the following best illustrates cognitive dissonance? A, you feel more confident about a decision after hearing others agree with you. B, you conform to a group's opinion even though you privately disagree. C, you believe exercise is important but haven't been to the gym in weeks and start convincing yourself that walking to the fridge counts. Or D, you realize someone you admire holds a different opinion than you and reconsider your stance. If you chose C, you've got it. That's classic cognitive dissonance, when your behavior doesn't align with your belief. And instead of changing your behavior, you change your thinking to reduce the internal tension. Now let's jump into today's focus: attribution theory and bias. Have you ever tripped over something in public and immediately thought, who put that there? But when you see someone else trip, your first thought might be, wow, they're really clumsy. Why do we judge ourselves and others so? Or maybe you aced a test and thought, I'm brilliant. But when you bombed one, you blamed unfair questions or a noisy classroom. These mental gymnastics are all part of how we assign blame and credit in our lives. Here's what we'll be breaking down today. We'll start with the question, what is attribution? We'll approach understanding how we explain behaviors, whether we point the finger at personality traits or external situations. We'll then look at the fundamental attribution error. We'll explore why we tend to blame people's character for their actions rather than their circumstances. Then we'll look at the self-serving bias. Ever notice how we take credit for our wins but blame others or bad luck when things go wrong? That's this bias in action. We'll talk about the actor-observer bias by looking at how our perspective changes when we're the ones acting versus when we're the ones watching someone else. Then we'll take a look at the just world hypothesis. We'll examine why we like to believe that people get what they deserve and the dangers of this thinking, especially when it comes to issues like injustice and victim blaming. Then we'll wrap up our conclusion with a bit of review. By the end of this lecture, you'll have a better understanding of how your mind makes snap judgments about yourself and others, and how these judgments are often biased in ways you might not realize. You'll be able to spot those biases in everyday situations, from classroom dynamics to social media debates, and even in how we view larger societal issues. So let's start with the basics. What is attribution? Attribution is all about how we explain behavior. When something happens, whether it's good or bad, we naturally ask, why did that happen? And more importantly, who or what is responsible? Sometimes we blame the person. Other times we blame the situation. And depending on how we attribute the cause, it can totally change how we react to people and events in our lives. Now, attribution comes in two flavors. There's internal attribution, also called dispositional attribution. This is when we believe that a person's behavior is due to their character, personality, or other inborn traits. For example, if someone cuts you off in traffic, you might think, wow, that person's a jerk. In this case, you're attributing their behavior to who they are as a person. The other kind of attribution is called external attribution, also called situational attribution. This is when we believe that a person's behavior is due to external circumstances, things outside their control. So if that same person cuts you off, but you think, well, maybe they're rushing to an emergency, then you're attributing their behavior to the situation. Let's make this real. Imagine you fail an exam. If you blame it on not studying enough, you're making an internal attribution. You believe your own effort, or lack of it, caused the failure. But if you blame it on the test being unfair or the classroom being too noisy, you're making an external attribution, pointing to factors outside of your control. Now let's flip it. Imagine a classmate fails the same exam. Do you assume that they didn't study enough? Or do you think maybe they had a rough day or faced unexpected challenges? How we explain their behavior versus our own can reveal some pretty interesting biases, which we'll be digging into today. Now, you might be wondering, why does this even matter? Well, how we explain behavior affects everything from how we treat people to how we see ourselves. If you constantly blame yourself for failures, it can hurt your self-esteem. But if you always blame external factors, well, you might never take responsibility or grow from your mistakes. And when it comes to judging others, our attributions can shape relationships, influence social dynamics, and even feed into stereotypes and prejudices. Before moving on, let's do an attention check. You see another student yawning in class. If you assume they're lazy instead of thinking that they stayed up late studying, what type of attribution are you making? Is it A, an internal or dispositional attribution? B, an external or situational attribution? C, the fundamental attribution error? Or D, the actor-observer bias? If you picked A, internal attribution, you're on point. You're assuming their behavior, yawning, is because of who they are, lazy, rather than considering external circumstances like them being tired from studying. All right, now that we know how attribution works, let's dive into one of the most common mistakes we make when explaining other people's behavior, the fundamental attribution error. This is the tendency to overestimate the role of personality and underestimate the role of situation when judging others. In other words, we're quick to assume that people act the way they do because of who they are, rather than considering what's going on around them. Again, going back to that driving example, if someone cuts you off and your first thought is, what a jerk, that person's reckless and doesn't know how to drive, you're playing into the fundamental attribution error. In this case, you're making an internal attribution, blaming their behavior on their personality. But what if that person was rushing to the hospital for an emergency, like we said before? Or maybe they were running late because of something completely out of their control. Or maybe they were taking someone to the airport and trying to make sure that they made it. We rarely consider the situation first, especially when it's someone we don't know. That's the fundamental attribution error at work, judging others more harshly and attributing their actions to their personality or their own thoughts. Let's look at a foundational study that's related to the development of the psychological concept of the fundamental attribution error. This is Jones and Harris's seminal 1967 work, The Attribution of Attitudes. This study had 3 different experiments in it, but we'll just be focusing on the first one. In this study, participants were assigned to read an essay about Fidel Castro. The essay was either pro-Castro or anti-Castro, and the participants were told that the author was either writing the article of their own choice, or that they were assigned this stance by a course instructor. The participants then had to evaluate on a 10-point scale the true attitude of the author towards Castro, whether they were actually pro-Castro or actually anti-Castro. Now, to understand the impact of this study, you need to understand a little bit about what the idea of Fidel Castro meant to the 1960s American audience. Fidel Castro was a communist revolutionary who took control of Cuba in 1959, overthrowing a US-backed leader. Castro aligned with the Soviet Union and was the first communist country in the Western Hemisphere. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had Americans on edge as the world was brought to the brink of nuclear disaster. Americans at the time saw Castro as a dangerous dictator. Supporting him would be seen as radical and anti-American. So what did the study find? The opinion presented in the speech was the main indicator of whether participants judged the author as actually pro or anti-Castro. But interestingly, it was still a significant predictor in the case when the participants were told that the author was assigned that particular stance and had no choice in what the essay was about. So whether the article was written of the author's own free will or as an assignment, people still attributed the content of the essay to the author's true opinion. A faulty internal attribution error. This is an example of the fundamental attribution error at work. Here's something interesting about this, though. As we've discussed a lot in this class, culture plays a big role in psychology, and that's especially so in how we make attributions. In Western cultures, like the United States, people are more likely to focus on individual traits and make dispositional attributions. We emphasize personal responsibility, independence, and individual success. But in collectivist cultures, like many Asian and African societies, people are more likely to consider situational factors. They see behavior as influenced by relationships, context, and the broader social environment. So while the fundamental attribution error is common, it might not be universal. The way we explain behavior depends on the cultural lens we're looking through. So we've seen how quick we are to judge others, thinking that their actions are due to their personality rather than their circumstances. But what happens when we bring ourselves into the equation? What happens when this is about success and failure? That's where the self-serving bias comes in. Let's see how our minds protect our self-esteem by taking credit for the good and dodging blame for the bad. So let's flip the mirror back on ourselves. Ever nail a job interview and think, wow, it's because I'm so charismatic, but then when you don't get the next one, suddenly it's, they just weren't hiring anyone anyway, or the interviewer was in a bad mood. That's the self-serving bias at work. It's our brain's sneaky little way of protecting our self-esteem by taking credit for the good stuff and shifting the blame when things go wrong. The self-serving bias is the tendency to attribute our successes to internal factors, like our skills or intelligence, but blame external factors for our failures. It's not that we're lying to ourselves on purpose, it's just a shortcut our mind takes to keep us feeling confident and in control. It's like having a built-in hype squad when things go well, and a convenient scapegoat when they don't. Let's look at a few everyday examples that you might recognize. In an academic setting, perhaps you gave a successful presentation. Then you'd say, well, I'm an incredible speaker. But if you bombed, then you might say, the audience and professor just didn't understand what I was trying to say. In sports, if you win a game, you've been practicing like crazy. If you lose, maybe the ref made terrible calls. And at work, if you get a promotion, then you obviously deserved it. You're the best. But if you get passed over, well, then the boss plays favorites. See how that works? When things go well, it's all you. But when things go south, it's everyone else's problem. A study by Dobbins and Russell from 1986 demonstrates the self-serving bias in action. This study explored whether the role someone plays in a group problem-solving task, either as a leader or subordinate, would affect how people attributed group success and failure. In this study, 144 undergraduate students engaged in a simulated manufacturing task. Groups of 3 were formed, with one member of the group being randomly selected as the leader. The leader trained and directed the subordinates as they manufactured and packaged paper airplanes. The leader was tasked with training the subordinates, and then they all worked together during a 20-minute work session. Groups were then randomly assigned to receive either high or low performance feedback. They were either told that their group was in the top 10% or the lowest 10%. All group members then completed a questionnaire to determine their attributions of group performance. The results? Low performance was explained by external factors. The leaders blamed the subordinates when feedback was low, and the subordinates blamed the leaders. This supports the idea that we blame our failures on external factors, rather than ourselves. Now, the self-serving bias isn't all bad. It does help us to maintain our confidence, especially after setbacks. But it can also hold us back if we refuse to take responsibility for our failures. If you constantly blame others or external factors, you might miss opportunities for growth. But on the flip side, if you never give yourself credit for your successes, it would hurt your self-esteem and damage your ability to complete your goals moving forward. So the key here is balance. Recognize when to own your mistakes, but also give yourself credit where it's due. Let's do another attention check. You win a game and say, well, I'm just naturally talented, but when you lose, you claim the ref was unfair. What bias is this? A, the fundamental attribution error, B, the self-serving bias, C, the actor-observer bias, or D, the just world hypothesis. If you picked B, the self-serving bias, you've got it. You're taking credit for your success, but blaming external factors for your failure. Classic move. So we've talked about how we explain our own successes and failures with the self-serving bias, and how we judge others more in alignment with internal attributions in the fundamental attribution error. But what happens when we compare our own actions directly to someone else's in the same situation? That's where the actor-observer bias comes in. It's the tendency for us to explain our behavior differently based off of whether we are acting in a situation or observing a situation. It's the same scenario, different story, depending on whether you're the actor or the observer. Let's say you're running late to class. You probably tell yourself, oh, traffic was insane today, or my alarm didn't go off. You blame the situation, external factors outside your control. But what if you see a classmate walk in late? You might think, well, they're lazy, or they don't care about being on time. Suddenly, it's not about the situation, it's about their personality. That's the actor or observer bias in action. In the actor situation, you made an external attribution, whereas in the observer situation, you made an internal attribution. So why do we do this? It's all about perspective. When we're the actor, we're focused on the environment around us. The traffic, the noise, the obstacles in our way. The situation is front and center. But when we're the observer, we don't have the inside scoop. We only see the person's behavior, so we assume it reflects who they are. It's like watching a movie. You only see what's on the screen, not what's happening behind the scenes, and you use that information to make a judgment. The actor-observer bias also ties back to cognitive dissonance. We like to think of ourselves in a positive light, so when we mess up, we blame the situation to protect our self-image. But when we see others mess up, we don't feel the same need to defend them, so we chalk it up to their character. It's another way our minds work to keep our self-perception consistent and comfortable. We've talked about how we explain individual behaviors, ours and others. But let's zoom out and look at how we explain events on a larger scale. Why do people sometimes believe that bad things only happen to bad people, or that good things are always rewarded? This brings us to the just world hypothesis, the belief that the world is fundamentally fair and that people get what they deserve. The just world hypothesis is the idea that the world operates like some kind of cosmic balance sheet. If you do good things happen to you. If you do bad things, you get what's coming to you. It's a comforting thought, right? It makes us feel like we have control over our fate. But here's the problem. When we believe the world is always fair, we're more likely to blame people for their own misfortunes. The dark side of the just world hypothesis is victim blaming. If we believe that people get what they deserve, then when something bad happens to someone, we assume they must have done something to deserve it. Think about the following statements. Well, they must have done something wrong to get fired. If they're poor, they probably didn't work hard enough. She was asking for it by dressing that way. These are all examples of just world thinking in action, and they can lead to harmful stereotypes and justify inequality. So why do we cling to the idea of a just world? Well, it's all about control. Believing that the world is fair makes it feel safer. If we think bad things only happen to bad people, then we can convince ourselves that as long as we do everything right, we'll be safe. Additionally, as social creatures, we seem to be hardwired to pay attention to fairness. This helps to promote effective cooperation and collective action. This is easier to do if we assume that the world is innately fair and just. People who aren't fair are then going against the natural order of things. But the truth is, bad things can happen to good people, and good things can happen to bad people. The world isn't always fair, and accepting that can actually make us more compassionate and understanding. Let's reflect. Think about a time when you or someone you know experienced a setback or a misfortune. Did people assume it was their fault? Have you ever caught yourself thinking that someone deserved a bad outcome, even if you didn't have all the facts? How does recognizing the just world hypothesis help you see those situations differently? So we've explored how we explain behavior, our own, others, and even broader social issues. We've seen how our minds are constantly working to make sense of the world, even if that means bending the evidence a little. But recognizing these biases is the first step toward thinking more critically, being more compassionate, and understanding the complexity of human behavior. Remember our quote, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." The way that we attribute people's actions is a model of their behavior. We're trying to understand and model what motivated them to behave. If we remember that all models are wrong, but some are useful, we can flexibly build different models to understand people's actions and make use of them as we gain more information about context and a situation. Let's wrap things up with a quick review. Today we explored how we explain behavior and how our brains are wired to take shortcuts that often lead to biased thinking. These biases might seem like minor issues, but they shape how we interact with the world, whether we're judging a friend, a stranger, or entire social groups. Here are the big ideas I want you to take away from today's lecture. Attribution is how we explain the causes of behavior, whether we blame internal traits or external circumstances. We tend to judge others more harshly than ourselves because of biases like the fundamental attribution error. The self-serving bias helps protect our self-esteem, but can prevent us from learning from our own mistakes. The actor-observer bias motivates us to make external attributions as the actor and internal attributions as the observer. Beliefs in the just world hypothesis can lead to harmful thinking, like victim blaming and reinforcing stereotypes. By recognizing these patterns, we can become more thoughtful, compassionate, and critical thinkers, not just about others, but also about ourselves. Before we wrap up, let's lock in today's learning with a couple of review questions. What is the fundamental attribution error? A. Blaming others' behavior on their personality while ignoring situational factors. B. Taking credit for personal success while blaming failures on external factors. C. Believing that people get what they deserve in life. Or D. Blaming your own mistakes on external circumstances. If you chose A, you're spot on. The fundamental attribution error is when we overestimate the role of personality and underestimate the power of the situation when judging others. How does the self-serving bias protect our self-esteem? A. By making us believe the world is fair and just. B. By blaming others for our mistakes and taking credit for theirs. C. By attributing our successes to our own abilities and our failures to external factors. Or D. By focusing on situational factors when we fail and ignoring them when we succeed. If you answered C, you nailed it. The self-serving bias helps protect our self-esteem by making us feel responsible for our wins, but blaming the environment when things go wrong. If there's one thing to take away from today's journey through attribution and bias, it's this. The mind is a storyteller, and not always an honest one. We simplify, we assume, we fill in gaps with beliefs that feel true, but might not be. And while these shortcuts help us move through the world more quickly, they can also steer us away from compassion, from context, and from understanding. But here's the beautiful part. Awareness is power. When we begin to see our biases, we can choose differently. We can rewrite the stories we tell about ourselves and about others. As always, stay curious, stay resilient, and above all, live life in flux. I'll see you in the next lecture.